Hello students, continuing on with the 1960s, focusing now on the administration of President Lyndon B. Johnson and the very turbulent election of 1968. Lyndon Baines Johnson was a very forceful leader. He had been a very skilled legislator in Congress for many years. He was an extremely forceful personality who knew how to get what he wanted. When Lyndon Johnson wanted something to happen, or he wanted you to go along with his plan, he would give you what became known as the treatment. And in the picture on the left here, you see a senator from Georgia, Richard Russell, receiving the treatment. Basically, Johnson would take you off by yourself. He would stare right into your eyes and he would tell you what needed to happen. And then he would take your arm, and if you refused to go along with him, he would squeeze your arm, continuing to stare you down and tell you what was going to happen. And as often as not, people who received the treatment would give in to Johnson's persuasion. Now, Johnson didn't really like the Kennedys, and partly that was because of the difference in their background. He had come from a dirt poor family in Texas. He had gotten his degree from a small teacher's college in that state, whereas, of course, the Kennedys had an incredibly privileged upbringing, went to Harvard, and so forth. And so, for Johnson, the Kennedys represented everything he disliked about the Washington establishment, their elitism, their snobbery, their assumption that they were the ones who were ordained to rule the nation. And so, when Johnson became president, you had a totally different style of leadership in the White House. But it should be said that in many ways, Johnson was more of a true liberal than the Kennedys were, and he was far more relentless in pursuing his progressive goals during his administration than the Kennedys had been. And nowhere was that more evident than in the field of civil rights. When Johnson became president, he said, "I want to be the best president the Negro has ever had." And in many ways, that was true. It was Johnson who, when in 1964, three young students who were trying to register voters during a campaign called Freedom Summer in Mississippi, when they disappeared, it was Johnson who insisted that the FBI go all out to try to find them. And after the FBI did manage to locate their bodies, to find their murderers. The names of these three students were Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner. And their story is told in an excellent film called Mississippi Burning. If you've never seen it, it's strongly recommended. So, when it became evident that no jury in Mississippi would convict the murderers of Goodman, Chaney, and Schwerner, LBJ made sure they were prosecuted on federal civil rights charges and that they did actually go to jail. And it was Johnson who got Kennedy's Civil Rights Act finally through Congress in 1964, which eliminated finally discrimination in public accommodations and in employment. So it was really the Civil Rights Act of 64 plus the Voting Rights Act of 65 that brought victory for the civil rights movement in the South. Johnson also was responsible for the Immigration Act of 1965, and this Immigration Act finally got rid of the strict quotas that had been imposed in the 1920s by Congress, especially on Asians. So the fact that there is a large number of Asians in this country today has a lot to do with the Civil Rights Act, or excuse me, the Immigration Act that Johnson signed into law in 1965. Johnson's slogan was the Great Society, just as Kennedy's had been the New Frontier. Johnson wanted to build what he called a Great Society. What did that mean? Well, first of all, Johnson announced that he was declaring war on poverty, that the federal government would do all that it could to eliminate poverty in America. A very grand and idealistic goal. The methods Johnson proposed to use, well, first, in August 1964, he got Congress to pass an Economic Opportunity Act, which created a number of community action agencies in different cities and towns around the country to try to build up impoverished communities and to help them to improve their standard of living. In January of 1965, Johnson introduced the Medicare law that Kennedy had wanted to propose, and actually added a new program called Medicaid, which, after these bills passed, for many years was the only way that poor Americans could get health insurance until the recent Affordable Care Act. April of that same year, Johnson beefed up the Kennedy administration's support for public education by increasing the funding for schools in poor districts by means of the Elementary and Secondary School Act. On August 5th, 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, which finally protected black voting throughout the nation. And in 1968, the National Housing Act provided funds to create about 600,000 units of low-income housing in cities and towns throughout the country. In terms of the environment, Johnson's wife, whose name was Lady Bird Johnson, was very interested in beautifying America. She launched a campaign against highway billboards that was very effective at the time, which she considered a form of pollution. And encouraged by the popularity of Lady Bird Johnson's efforts, Johnson endorsed and signed the Water Quality Act of 1965 and the Air Quality Act of 1968 with the goal of removing or decreasing water and air pollution. Well, all of that sounds great on paper, but sometimes, as we know, the best laid plans of mice and men go oft astray. And the results of the Great Society programs were decidedly mixed. For example, Medicare and Medicaid did give health insurance to a great many elderly and poor people who hadn't had it before, but it had the unintended consequence that medical prices began to skyrocket, because now doctors and hospitals knew that anybody or most Americans now had access to health insurance, and so they felt liberated to begin charging more and more for medicine and for their services. And so really the outrageous medical prices that we pay today, you can trace those back to Johnson's creation of Medicare and Medicaid. But this rise in medical prices was only a portion of what became known as the Great Inflation. It was really under the administration of Johnson that prices for many things began to climb to be much closer to the levels that we associate them with today. So gone were the good old days of 5-cent hamburgers and so forth that your grandparents may have told you about. In terms of the education support, powerful lawmakers often managed to get those funds diverted to schools in affluent areas, like mostly white suburbs, rather than the inner city or poor areas they were designed to serve. Now, the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act were very successful in the South in terms of finally ending segregation. So that was a victory for Johnson. But as the South began to desegregate, the problems for blacks in many northern cities became more and more glaring. And what you had in northern cities as a result of the great migration of blacks to the north, increasingly blacks had moved into inner city neighborhoods that formerly had been dominated by Irish or Italians or Germans or Jews, what have you. And typically, at that time, what would happen when even one black family moved into a neighborhood, the white people in the neighborhood would often take off for the suburbs. We call this white flight. And it would have devastating consequences for many northern cities because, for one thing, it lowered the city's tax base and it made the cities less able to cope or to provide public services for the growing black population in the cities. And it also meant that neighborhoods began to decay, and the new public housing projects that were being built were a very poor substitute for the formerly stable neighborhoods. The, the, the quality of these buildings was often very cheap and shoddy, and they became notorious as places where gangs developed and where a great deal of crime took place. And some of them, like the Cabrini Green project in Chicago or the Pruitt-Igoe project in St. Louis, became absolutely legendary for this kind of activity. Um, and so the results of Johnson's war on poverty for the cities were in many ways almost uniformly negative. Another effect of white flight was that many jobs moved from the inner cities out to the suburbs as corporations relocated their headquarters outside of the inner cities. And that meant that there were very few jobs for African Americans who lived in the inner cities, who could not really afford to commute to the suburbs in order to get jobs. And so the increasing misery of the inner cities led to a number of very violent and destructive riots during the late 1960s in many cities, in the north and also in the far west. You see in the picture here a scene from the very famous riot in Watts, which was an African American neighborhood in LA, Los Angeles, California, in 1965. There were actually 34 deaths during the Watts riots and 1,072 injuries recorded. And so this became an increasingly depressing spectacle on the national news as the 1960s continued. Well, Dr. King and other civil rights leaders set their sights on the North after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, because obviously these northern cities were de facto segregated. You had many white people in the suburbs, mostly blacks in the inner cities, places like Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit, and so forth. And so really the schools were segregated, just as they had been in the South. But when the civil rights movement began to campaign in the northern cities, they met with a remarkable level of apathy, hostility, and frustration. And white residents of these northern and western areas were often just as unresponsive as segregationist Southerners had been. So this was something that overshadowed the later years of Dr. King, the failure of many of these civil rights campaigns in the North. Meanwhile, the war in Vietnam began to get more and more intense. And this is one example where you could say the Cold War got very hot in this proxy war between North and South Vietnam. The incident that led to massive U.S. involvement in the Vietnam took place in August 1964 when a U.S. Navy destroyer reported that the North Vietnamese had actually torpedoed their ship. And later it turned out that this was due to faulty radar and the overreaction of the officers of the ship, that they had totally misinterpreted what had happened. But nevertheless, people believed it at the time. And this was what inspired Congress to pass a law called the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, where the attack had supposedly taken place. And what this law did was essentially to give Johnson the authority to do whatever he wanted in Vietnam. Even though Congress did not declare war on North Vietnam, it essentially gave Johnson a blank check to escalate the war, which he did. And so this was the first in really a series of precedent-setting actions by Congress in which they abdicated their constitutional authority to declare war and increasingly just handed over to the executive branch, so that in recent years, presidents, both Democratic and Republican, have carried on undeclared wars in many places. So by July 1965, we had 125,000 ground troops in Vietnam, and we were also ruthlessly bombing North Vietnam back to the Stone Age, a bombing campaign in which millions of North Vietnamese civilians were killed. Well, the North Vietnamese retaliated with a massive offensive, which was launched on the Buddhist holiday of Tet in January of 1968, in which they struck simultaneously and without warning at a number of different places in South Vietnam. You see them there on the map. This Tet offensive was devastatingly effective, and it resulted in Johnson increasing our force in South Vietnam to more than 500,000 troops. Well, the Tet offensive, which was, by the way, reported on the national news by none other than the CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite, who was called the most trusted man in America, shocked Americans and really began to start turning American public opinion against the war in Vietnam, and made many people wonder if this was in fact an unwinnable war. And that feeling only grew when it became known in 1968 that on March 16th of that year, a detachment of U.S. soldiers under the command of Lieutenant William Calley had gone berserk in a small village called My Lai, which the soldiers suspected was harboring Viet Cong soldiers, and had massacred every man, woman, and child in that village. So the My Lai massacre really tarnished our PR that we were in Vietnam to try to win freedom and peace for the Vietnamese people. Much later incident, but one I want to mention in this context, had to do with a famous photograph. You see it there on the top right, of a little girl in 1972 who has just been sprayed with the chemical produced by the Dow Chemical Company called napalm. Basically, napalm was a chemical that, when it was sprayed on trees, would cause the trees to burst into flame, and so it was used to deforest Vietnam so that we could better see what the Viet Cong were doing. But as you see here, sometimes the napalm would fall on people, and it was terribly, terribly painful. And so the outrage about this photograph of the little girl really turned even more people against the war in Vietnam. By the way, the young girl in the picture is now an American citizen. She managed to escape to the United States and is living here happily ever after. But the trauma of this napalm bombing became very famous in America. And so you start to see much more massive anti-war protests throughout the country, with mostly young students chanting slogans like, "Hell no, we won't go," and "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" And so you see that for LBJ, the war in Vietnam was really eroding his image as a very progressive and idealistic leader. I want to talk about the students right now. Student activism against the Vietnam War was part of a broader movement that became known as the New Left. And it was centered on universities and colleges, which, as I mentioned before, had expanded dramatically with the rise of the baby boom generation. So what you have in colleges and universities at this point in time is a huge generation of young people, many of whom had been raised according to the permissive parenting strategies advocated by Dr. Spock in his book, um, and who were used to having their voices heard, expressing their feelings, and getting what they wanted. And so that very much influenced the 60s protest movements as they unfolded. They were also generally very privileged young people who didn't have to worry about money. And so that meant that they were freer, in a sense, to pursue their protest agendas. Now, the first important place where campus activism started happening was the University of California at Berkeley in the San Francisco Bay Area. And the movement at Berkeley really started in 1964 when a number of young people who had volunteered in Mississippi during Freedom Summer returned to college in the fall. And they had really been radicalized by their actions in Mississippi. And they were ready to take on the establishment at Berkeley. And so they formed, well, actually a number of groups to protest on the war, civil rights, and other issues. And when the Berkeley administration tried to clamp down on their activities, this spawned what became known as the free speech movement at Berkeley, to try to radicalize students to resist what they saw as oppression from the college administration. And one famous speech that was given during the free speech movement was by a young activist named Mario Savio on the steps of a campus building called Spruill Hall on December 2nd, 1964. And this is one of the videos in your supplementary videos folder, so I'd like for you to go and watch Savio's speech, and then come right back. All right, well, students that I show this to are often not impressed with Mario Savio. One student recently said that it wasn't a speech, it was a childish tantrum. And you see that there's some truth in that. But I think this speech is very interesting as an expression of the mindset of these young student radicals. Basically, when Savio talks about not wanting to be a cog in a machine, when he says that you have to throw down your body on the gears and stop the machine from running, what is he talking about? Well, perhaps you could think of the machine as the entire system that had been running in the United States ever since World War II, that had brought such great prosperity to America. The industrial system, the corporate system, the political establishment with the Cold War, the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower had talked about in his farewell address. And it points to, I think, a kind of tragic misunderstanding between these young baby boomers and their parents. The parents had just wanted to provide them with everything good in life that they hadn't had during the Depression. And so they gave these young children everything they could possibly want in terms of material things, but it really wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for the baby boomer generation. And they felt a certain emptiness. And they felt the aftermath of that idealism of the new frontier. They really did want to make the world a better place. And so essentially what happened was that the baby boomer generation, many people, not all, but many of them, turned against their parents' materialistic way of life, and they struck out in this new direction. Of course, another factor that led to especially the anti-war protests by student activists was the draft. And you may ask yourself, well, you know, we've been at war now really since beginning of 2002 in Afghanistan and almost as long in Iraq. Why haven't there been the kind of massive student protests against that war? Well, the answer is very simple. We have an all-volunteer army now No one has to go fight in those wars. It's choice. But during the 60s, any young man who was healthy was liable to be drafted into the army and to go to Vietnam. And so these campus radicals saw that in their future and they rebelled. Now, it happened there was an exception. Normally, if you were enrolled in a university or college, you would be exempted from the draft. And so that led to many cases of people trying to stay in college as long as possible to avoid the draft. But certainly the draft was a major reason for the fiery protests of these young people in college. One of the nationwide groups that came out of the Berkeley free speech movement was known as SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. SDS's goal was to go into communities all across the country and to try to build a sort of grassroots democracy, empowering people to make decisions at the local level, somewhat like the AFL had wanted back in the 19th century. And so, again, this is a very idealistic goal. And you see in the early days between 64 and 67 of student protest, a continuing focus on politics, political change, nonviolent methods trying to change the system peacefully from within to promote civil and human rights and human freedom. But beginning in 1967, a radically different approach began to be taken just across San Francisco Bay in a neighborhood that was called the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood of San Francisco because its center was the corner of Haight and Ashbury streets. And the movement that emerged from the Haight neighborhood became known as the counterculture, and it had very different values from the more political type of activism. The Haight counterculture, or the hippie movement, as it's more popularly called, was sparked in many ways by a man named Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary had a PhD. He was a psychologist. He was a professor at Harvard University. But he left that job because he felt he had a mission to get people all across America to try the drug LSD, commonly known as acid. Now, obviously, this is a hallucinogenic drug. It causes people to go on what were called trips. Could be a good trip or a bad trip. But Leary really believed that LSD was the key to expanding people's consciousness, to getting them out of their old materialistic rut, and to get them to open their minds and embrace a new way of life. So he went all over the country and told people to, quote, tune in, turn on to acid, and drop out of society. And many people listened to Timothy Leary, especially in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood. And so the movement that emerges basically turns away from political action, and the idea is that we're going to change the world through LSD by changing ourselves, changing our consciousness, changing the way we think, and actualizing ourselves in that way. And so many people did drop out of society. Many of them came to San Francisco, especially in 1967, which happened to be the year that the Beatles, great British rock group, produced their album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which is a brilliant album, one of the most important albums in rock and roll history, but was very much influenced by the Beatles' use of LSD, and that is evident from the song, the John Lennon song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. If you look at that title carefully, you see the letters LSD, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And so, as people listened to Sgt. Pepper in San Francisco, as more and more people came into San Francisco to try LSD and join the hippie counterculture, to wear the hippie clothes that we're all familiar with and so forth, Um, what developed that summer became known as the Summer of Love. This was an attempt to harness this energy of all these tens of thousands of young people that were coming into San Francisco. Oh, by the way, one of the early events in '67 in San Francisco was the Human Be-In. You see a poster there. So we've moved from sit-ins for political purposes to be-ins, led by Timothy Leary, among others. You see there on the poster. Um, well, one of your videos in the supplementary folder is called The Summer of Love, and it's a little longer than usual, so you don't necessarily have to go watch it this instant before finishing the lecture, but please watch it. It's about half an hour long, and you will have some questions about it. Actually, 3 of your discussion questions this time come from that video, from the 3 segments of the video, which were news reports that ran on NBC News during the Summer of Love. And so I won't talk about that anymore right now, but please do watch that video carefully and let it inspire you to discuss fully on the discussion board the meaning of the Summer of Love. Well, obviously, rock music was another great influence during the Summer of Love, and many bands from the San Francisco Bay Area, like Janis Joplin's group Big Brother and the Holding Company, were an important part of it. But another band, I think, in a way, really epitomizes the counterculture during the Summer of Love, and that's the Jefferson Airplane, led by Grace Slick. And I've posted a video of a song they came out with in 1969 called We Can Be Together. Now, this video has some very blue language, so if you're offended by that, you don't have to watch it necessarily, but I think this tells us a lot about how the culture changed between the 1962 New Frontier album and 1969 when this song came out. So take a look, and we'll talk about it in just a second. Wow. Times really had changed. We'll come back to this, but I want to show you some of the lyrics here. What's different between this song and the Kingston Trio's New Frontier song? Well, the Kingston Trio song was full of idealism and youthful enthusiasm to change the world. This has a very different, somewhat darker tone. It's talking about people that have dropped out of society. They've become outlaws in the eyes of America. And they're willing to do things like steal, cheat, lie, forge, hide, and deal drugs, of course. And they embrace labels like obscene, lawless, hideous, dangerous, dirty, and violent. Okay? And this song does have a political message against private property, so you see a sort of communist sub-theme going on here. They're going to put people up against the wall, which is what happened during communist revolutions when capitalist pigs, wealthy people, would be lined up against a wall and shot. But the political message here is not the idealistic message of the early civil rights movement, for example. It's something much more cynical, much darker, and threatening to the majority of Americans who were not part of the hippie movement. So, real turn as increasingly people become disillusioned with political solutions, and they turn to this new way of dropping out and trying to change society through drug-induced trips, rock music, and the entire hippie lifestyle. Even for those who continued to try to change society through politics, there was a shift. Beginning in 1966, when a young member of SNCC named Stokely Carmichael gave a very famous speech in which he said that young African Americans were tired of nonviolent strategy as promoted by Dr. King, and he announced, "We want black power." So, in other words, a move away from civil disobedience towards perhaps violent resistance. And nobody epitomized this more than Malcolm X. And your documents for this module and your other discussion for this module center on the debate between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X over nonviolence, whether this was really an appropriate strategy for blacks, or whether blacks, as Malcolm X argued, should arm themselves and in self-defense resist oppression. Very, very powerful and interesting debate that I hope you will discuss to the full, and one that certainly has implications to this day. But for people that followed Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, there was a clean break from the idea that Dr. King had promoted, that blacks needed to forgive their oppressors and win them over with nonviolent love, into what King called the beloved society, and rather the idea that black resistance should take center stage. And it was black resistance that was promoted by a very important group in Oakland, also in the San Francisco Bay Area, called the Black Panther Party, founded by a man named Huey P. Newton in the fall of 1966. Now, the Black Panthers did many things that other community action groups did to try to help underprivileged people in Oakland. For instance, giving milk to young school children who might not otherwise have it. But what really scared many white Americans and put people on guard against the Black Panthers was their open militancy and their also especially their carrying of weapons. Now, it just so happened that this was perfectly legal in California at the time. May seem kind of strange, but the California gun laws at the time were kind of the reverse of ours in Georgia today. In Georgia now, you can carry a gun if you have a permit and if you conceal it. But in California in 1966, you couldn't carry a concealed weapon. You could only carry a weapon if you held it openly for everyone to see. And so what the Black Panthers did was to walk around the streets of Oakland carrying rifles and shotguns, very openly flaunting their philosophy of violent resistance to white oppression. And so, needless to say, this put the local police on guard. Oh, by the way, the governor of California at the time was Ronald Reagan, and he quickly got the California legislature to change the gun laws. But during the period that the Panthers were carrying guns on the streets of Oakland, there were 5 incidents in which police killed Black Panthers between 1967 and 1970, and 11 reported shootings of police by the Panthers. And so many Panthers wound up in jail, some dead. But this Panther movement really became a very visible symbol of black resistance in the late 60s, and the decline of King's dream, which of course came to a crashing end in 1968. A very, very eventful year, happens to be the year I was born, but one of the most eventful and tragic years in American history. Well, Johnson's popularity was really in the toilet by now. He had to scale back many of his Great Society War on Poverty programs because, excuse me, so much funding was being sent to finance the war on Vietnam. And so, unexpectedly, a senator named Eugene McCarthy challenged Johnson in the Democratic primaries in 1968 on the platform of stopping the war in Vietnam. McCarthy promised to end the war, and that inspired many young radicals to join the McCarthy campaign, to cut off their hippie long hair and to get quote-unquote clean for Gene so that he could defeat LBJ. And what do you know, when McCarthy entered the Democratic primary in New Hampshire, he managed to win 42% of the vote, somewhat reminiscent of Bernie Sanders in this year's election, and really just shocked Lyndon Johnson. He had no idea that he could even come close to being defeated in a primary election. And so, after thinking it over, on March 31st, Johnson made the shocking announcement that he was withdrawing from the presidential race, that he would not seek another term as president. Well, that led to a real free for all as a number of politicians got into the race, um, Robert Kennedy being the first one. So, meanwhile, on April the 4th, 1968, Dr. King was in Memphis, um, lending moral support to a strike by sanitation workers in that city. And it was in Memphis, at the Lorraine Motel where he was staying, that King, standing on the balcony, was assassinated by a man named James Earl Ray. You see the famous picture here just after King has been shot by Ray. And after King's death, there was shock and horror throughout the country, and riots, bloody riots in a number of urban centers in response to King's assassination. But it wasn't over. On June 6th, California voters had their primary election, which was won by Bobby Kennedy. And so Kennedy gave his victory speech at a hotel in Los Angeles, and then went downstairs, was being led away from the podium, when a man named Sirhan Sirhan came out of the shadows and assassinated Bobby Kennedy. So you see here, again, the cynicism, the darkness, the despair, all the dreams of the early 1960s for revolutionizing life on the planet, making it a better place, have just fallen to the ground. And the mood of the country was almost one of hopelessness, fear, and shock, wondering, is this America? How far have we fallen? It was in the midst of this mood that Richard Nixon began to make his political comeback, running for the Republican nomination as president. And very intelligently, he chose to run on a law and order platform. So he reached out and appealed to those Americans who were shocked by the violence in the streets, the riots, the assassinations, and promised that if elected president, he would restore peace, he would restore law and order in America. But the race for the Democratic nomination became even more chaotic after the death of Robert Kennedy. Vice President Hubert Humphrey had gotten into the race, and he was nominated at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. But that convention was marked by a great deal of violence and uproar that was instigated by a group called the Yippies. The Yippies, led by a man named Jerry Rubin. Now, Rubin's idea was that the whole democratic process in America was a complete farce, something meaningless, and so Rubin's strategy with the Yippies was to do street theater in the streets of Chicago, to do ridiculous things in the streets, to try to dramatize what he saw as the meaninglessness of American politics. But Chicago was ruled with an iron fist by Mayor Richard Daley. So even as Vice President Hubert Humphrey was winning the nomination, Daley had his police out in the streets of Chicago to control the Yippies, and the result was what became known as the police riot, when being taunted by the Yippies, the cops snapped and began simply beating protesters in the streets, as America watched, of course, through the national news media. By the way, Jerry Rubin, like many former hippies, Rubin later became a successful entrepreneur and businessman. So you could say he went from yippie to yuppie. And very ironically, Jerry Rubin was killed while he was trying to dash across a busy LA street to get to a business meeting. that he was late for. He was run over by a car. Very ironic ending for the leader of the Yippies. There was a third party campaign in this election mounted by the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, who was an ardent segregationist. And like Nixon, he appealed to disgruntled white people who were shocked at the direction the country was going, but in an even more radical way than Nixon. And actually, Wallace managed to win an astonishing 13.5% of the vote and the electoral votes of 5 southern states. However, Nixon did manage to win the election barely, defeating Hubert Humphrey. Well, with the victory of Richard Nixon, those student activists or young activists who still believed in politics were finally disenchanted with the American political process. And so SDS, instead of continuing its more conventional political action, decided to go underground, and they began calling themselves the Weather Underground, or Weatherman. And this name came from a song by Bob Dylan called Subterranean Homesick Blues, which contains the line, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows." So Weatherman lived a secret existence and carried out bombings of important government facilities, like, for example, the Pentagon, during the late 1960s and the early 1970s. So even though they tried to avoid loss of life, they were essentially a terrorist group that in many ways set the tone for the wildly chaotic 1970s decade. However, I want to direct your attention to a couple of videos in the supplementary videos folder. I forgot when we were on the slide about LBJ earlier in this lecture to ask you to look at a campaign ad that Johnson used against his Republican challenger Barry Goldwater in 1964. It's one of the most vicious attack ads in American history, and it's in the videos folder there. You'll see how Johnson essentially accuses Goldwater of being a warmonger and warns of the most severe consequences if Goldwater is elected. If you think the current round of attack ads in this presidential election are bad, wait till you see this one. But also in that folder is a video of Neil Armstrong in July 1969 fulfilling John F. Kennedy's dream and walking on the moon as part of the Apollo moon landing. And so take a look at that with his catchphrase, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." It was a moment of achievement and of dreams fulfilled at the end of a very turbulent and in many ways disappointing decade, the 1960s.